So let's continue these suttas. If you can't hear me properly, anything, please let me know, because I'm just assuming it is okay. So please. Okay, so now we're going to start with the gradual training, and the sutta we're going to have a look at is one of my favorite suttas about the gradual training. It's found in the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length discourses, and it is the shorter sutta on the simile of the elephant's footprint. And this is a sutta which talks about the gradual training in the same way as if you are seeking for an elephant. When you seek for an elephant in the woods, you look for the footprints, and then when you see the footprint, then you follow the footprint until eventually you see that elephant in the forest. And only when you see it with your own eyes, then do you know that it is the real deal. Before that, you may have some uncertainty. In this case, it talks specifically about a particular type of elephant, the large one, and only when you see it do you know that it is that sort of elephant. In the same way, you follow the gradual training, and when you see for yourself the results of that path, you get the same insights as the Buddha, only then do you know that you are in the presence of the elephant. The Buddha, the word Pali word, one of the Pali words for elephant is naga, and naga means like any great being, right? The elephant is great. The Buddhas and the kind of arahants are also called nagas in the same way, because they are kind of great beings in a sense. They're like the elephants in the mental sense, if you like. So this is what this is about, and the gradual training is a very important type of teaching in the suttas. You find it so many places. If you go to the Digha Nikaya, the long discourses, it is found there, I think, 12 times. There's only 34 discourses in the Digha Nikaya, and the gradual training is 12 of those 34 discourses. In the Majjhima Nikaya, you find it about 10 times or something like that, probably. You also find it in the Anguttara Nikaya, so it is everywhere. It's one of those things that is kind of pervasive, and you know that the Buddha, he must have taught it to many different situations, different people, in slightly different ways, slightly different angles on this gradual training, and it shows you that it is one of those fundamental parts of the Buddha's teachings. And what it is also, it is really just an expansion of the Noble Eightfold Path, and to try to point that out as we go along, and you will see how it maps onto the Noble Eightfold Path. And this is one of those things about the suttas. They are so interrelated to each other in so many different ways. And one way of looking at it is like a jigsaw puzzle. You have this big picture, which is the Dhamma, and you have the little pieces all fitting together very nicely. And this is what we are seeing here as well. So very important, also very useful framework, because it shows you what we have to do, right? How we have to practice, where we are. We can sort of figure out where we are at on this gradual training, and then we can kind of take it from there, if you like. So now let us have a look at this. We'll start with the very first paragraph here, and and it says here, then so too Brahmin, but the Buddha has just been given the simile of the elephant, and now he says, so too Brahmin, here a Tathagata appears in the world, accomplished, fully awakened, perfect in true knowledge and conduct, or perfect in insight and conduct, sublime knower of the world, incomparable leader of tameable persons, teacher of gods and humans, awakened, blessed. Yeah, so let's stop there. And this is the standard passage that many of you will know from the suttas, the Itipiso chant, right? So certainly those of you who have a kind of Buddhist background, you will know straight away the Itipiso Bhagava Arahang Samma Sambuddho Vijja Charana Sampanno, etc. That is that one there. And that is, what that is, it occurs so many places in the suttas. It is something you find everywhere in the suttas. And of course it is how the Buddha expresses that a Buddha should be understood. So here the Buddha is explaining these are the qualities, these are the characteristics of a Buddha, or an Arahant as well, if you like, that makes the Buddha special. This is what really matters about the Buddha, these qualities right here. So if you want to think about who the Buddha is, this is how you should think about this. And of course the point is that if you think about who the Buddha is in the right way, and again this is one of those foundations for meditation practice, for samadhi, for everything else. If you think about the Buddha in the right way, then you feel a sense of uplift, you feel a sense of joy, because you realize that you have in your life the very foremost of teachers is still available. His teachings are still there, and you are a student, if you like, of the foremost teacher in the world. I would argue that to me it's obvious that the Buddha was the greatest human being in history. There is nobody quite like that, precisely because he understood the most profound truth of human existence, and he was able to show us the way to the answer to the very meaning of life. How can that not be the greatest human being in history? It has to be. Everything else fades by comparison. And when you get the feeling that you have the greatest human being in history as your teacher, it becomes very powerful, it becomes very inspiring, and you sit down and you kind of get this goosebumps, right, when you think like that. And then that gives rise to a sense of happiness inside, a joy, which then drives you forward on this path of samadhi and meditation. So to get this right, to think about the Buddha in the right way, can be very, very useful in our practice. And this is why I want to spend a little bit of time on this very simple sentence here, just to think about this a little bit. And many of these things, it's really up to us what we make out of this. This is just my way of looking at this, and there are many ways of dealing with this. But because I've been a monk for over 20 years now, and I've been thinking about this for a while, maybe some of these things might be useful to you as well. So let us start from the beginning of this paragraph. Actually, before I even say anything about the details here, one of the things that is interesting about this list, if you look at those qualities of the Buddha, they are basically about two things. One is the Buddha's understanding, right? His understanding of the world, if you like, or of people, or psychology, or whatever it is. So his insight is number one. And the second thing is that he is the teacher. And of course, those two are very closely related to each other. So these are the two kind of main pillars of what the Buddha is. What the Buddha is not, the things that you will see that is missing from there, is, for example, all these miraculous qualities. Sometimes you hear about the Buddha and he's given all these kind of miraculous, amazing qualities. You know, he can read minds, and maybe it's very possible that he could read minds, but it's not mentioned here. The idea of doing all kind of psychic phenomena, walking on water and kind of walking into mountains and flying through the air and all this kind of stuff, which sounds, you got to admit, it sounds pretty cool, but but it doesn't really measure. It is not what the Buddha really is about. And what is so fascinating when you see what the Buddha, the way he actually talks about psychic powers and these kind of things, supernormal powers in the suttas, the Buddha says quite literally, this is in the Kevada Sutta, in the Digha Nikaya 11, he says at the beginning of that sutta that I detest, I abhor, I'm disgusted. This is literally the words he used, very, very strong words. I detest these kind of supernormal powers, specifically things like mind reading, things like flying through the air and that kind of stuff. And then he says, why do I have this kind of, why am I disgusted by these things? And then he explains that, well, for those people who are already disciples of the Buddha, who already have faith and confidence, they will say, sadhu, sadhu, what a wonderful thing that, this is possible to do. Wow, we are so fortunate to have teacher with such powers. But those people who are not disciples of the Buddha, those people who are kind of more skeptical, standing on the outside, they will say, yeah, just some kind of magic trick, right? What do you expect? And all you need is kind of some kind of magic understanding, and then anyone can do this kind of stuff. So people are not really impressed by these things. These things don't really matter. They will dismiss it as some kind of magic trick. And in my experience, that is pretty much exactly true. People are skeptical about these things. They will be skeptical, and probably for fairly good reasons, because the vast majority of people who do this kind of stuff, they are not really, they do precisely do magic tricks, and that is exactly what's going on. So for the Buddha, these things are not important. That is not what makes a Buddha. And I think it is something that we should take on board. There's far too much interest in the world, in psychic phenomena. Of course, it is interesting, but that is only a sideshow of the Buddhist path. That is not really what it is about. What it is about insight, wisdom, understanding. You may see somebody fly in the air, but it's not really going to make you very happy in the long run. It's a bit of entertainment, right? Whoa, wow, really cool. And then afterwards, you're back to kind of square one again. So what really makes you happy, what has a potential for overcoming your suffering and make your life better, is the wisdom of the Buddha, not the supernormal phenomena. So it's important to kind of focus on the right place. So this is the first thing that you see in this particular paragraph. It's all very down to earth, very practical. And I will talk about one other thing that it is not in a second, hopefully. So we'll get to that shortly. But let's now begin at the beginning here. And here we have the idea that a Tathagata appears in the world. The word Tathagata is the word that the Buddha uses about himself. It has a slightly mystical feeling. It is a word that existed in India prior to Buddhism, and it seems to mean basically someone who is spiritually accomplished, right? Someone who has kind of attained the highest happiness or something like that. That seems to be what it means, or someone who has some special insight. And the Buddha would often use the existing vocabulary at the time and apply that to the Buddhist teachings. So it's just a word of saying someone who's spiritually accomplished, really. That's really all it means. But it does sound, when you see it like that, it does sound a bit mysterious. And I think that is kind of the part of the idea, in a sense. And he appears in the world. That also sounds slightly mysterious, right? What does that mean, appears in the world? Suddenly just bang, he's there, or what does it actually mean? And so appearing in the world here, what it means is just that someone occasionally, every now and again, throughout the long history, samsaric history, someone through the right conditioning, through happening on the right practice, the right path, by having perhaps some of the teachers who are guiding you in the right direction. Every now and again, somebody happens to be conditioned in such a way that they are able to gain this type of wisdom that the Buddha gains. There is no path, right? And this is kind of this is the thing which makes it so haphazard in a sense. All the conditions just have to come together, but there is no structure to that. It doesn't happen through a structure or through a particular way. It just happens because occasionally these things just happen. That is all there's really to it. And this is, I think, a very important point from the idea of early Buddhist teachings, is that there is no such thing really in the suttas as a bodhisattva path. The bodhisattva is the Buddha before his awakening, but is not actually following a path. It's more like the conditions just happen to come together, and then the Buddha arises in the world as a consequence. So it's a very uncertain thing here. It's a very unreliable thing here, and it's not something that you can decide that you want to become a Buddha in the future, because there is no structure to that. It just happens occasionally in this way. So that is what it means. So the Buddha, in a sense, you could argue, is a natural phenomenon. Like I was saying yesterday, right? Conditions coming together, and when the conditions come together, that boat which has no steering mechanism, when the wind comes from the south, it goes to the north. When the current comes from the east, it goes to the west. When the certain conditions come together, you get the Buddha in exactly the same way. That is what it really means. And then the Buddha comes, and then, of course, the teachings become available. And one of the consequences of that kind of view of a Buddha is that you realize how precious these teachings are in the world, precisely because it is so unreliable and so uncertain. when they are there, it is a very precious opportunity to practice these things and then to use these teachings for your own well-being and also for the well-being of everyone else around us. So that is kind of one of the consequences of this uncertainty here. So that's all it really means, that Tathagata appears in the world. This natural phenomenon called the Buddha arises because of natural phenomena. And then it has the next word here, accomplished, and that is the word arahant. Yeah, arahant literally means the worthy one who is worthy. Worthy of what? Worthy of, I suppose, being a real teacher, because you have actually penetrated to some real understanding of things. So you are worthy of being a teacher, and because you are the supreme teacher in the world, you are worthy of respect, worthy of all of those things that a teacher normally is worthy of. Respect, offerings, kindness, being supported, and all of these kind of things. How we normally look at a teacher, but even much more high than that. Fully awakened, Samma Sambuddho. The word Buddha in the Pali language literally means to be awake. Yeah, and the word Buddha is still used in some of the Indo-European languages in the terms of actually meaning awake. You still find that word in that sense in the Indo-European languages. And to me, that is perhaps more meaningful than enlightened. I like the idea of awakened. So what does it mean? In what sense is the Buddha actually awake? What does it mean to be awake? And it means a number of things. One of the things that it means, of course, is that you have this insight into the nature of existence. You know what it means to be a human being. This includes, of course, the three characteristics, the dependent origination, rebirth, karma, the ending of rebirth. All of that is part of that insight. You have understood something about what it is to be a human being or any kind of being. So that is part of that. Another aspect of this idea of awakening is that you have abandoned all the defilements of the mind. So you have this incredible purity of mind. You're no longer you're liberated from those things because these things are the tyrants that drive you in the wrong direction, drive you towards suffering, etc. all the time. So this is part of liberation. Liberation means, in part, to be liberated from the defilements. In the suttas, you have this idea of being liberated in mind, ceto vimutti. And ceto vimutti is precisely the idea of having abandoned the hindrances and the defilements, because these are the slave drivers by which you feel trapped. You feel that you have no freedom, you have no ability to maneuver yourself as you wish. Once the defilements are gone, the mind becomes incredibly malleable and workable. This is one of the qualities of the mind which is free, is that you can use it for anything almost. You say to the mind, do this, and the mind does that. But the mind which has defilements, you say, watch the breath, still doesn't watch the breath, right? You know what it's like sometimes. You say, do metta, or anger instead. Yeah. And this is the problem with the mind with defilements. It does not do what you want it to do. You have no sense of freedom. Once the defilements are gone, then the freedom arises as a consequence of that. You're no longer the slave. You are the master of yourself, using your mind in whatever way you want to do. And of course, another aspect of awakening, which is perhaps the most important one for us, is the idea of ending of all suffering, attaining the highest happiness. Yeah, and this is kind of happiness here. When I use the word happiness, I mean happiness in a very broad sense. I don't mean kind of some kind of silly happiness, worldly happiness. I mean happiness really profound, peace, stillness, compassion, contentment, loving kindness, understanding, right? That sort of happiness, something very profound. And of course, that is the thing that we're all really searching for in life. That is what you discover as you get to this point. One of the things that is not part of awakening, and that is necessarily a full understanding of the world, how the world works, what you might call philosophy. Philosophy is not really part of the Buddha's teachings. The Buddhist teaching is a very pragmatic path, a practical path, how to overcome problems and how to develop the highest happiness, but it's not really philosophy. Philosophy is something that comes in later Buddhism. There is one of the books of the Tipitaka. Tipitaka literally means the three baskets. One of the baskets is the Abhidhamma. And the Abhidhamma, that is where you find Buddhist philosophy. Abhidhamma is precisely about setting out all the phenomena in the world. The world is like this. So many different types of mind, so many different types of matter. This is how they interrelate. This is how they work together. That is what the Abhidhamma is about. That is philosophy here. But the Buddha specifically says that I only teach you a little bit. What I teach you is the Four Noble Truths. Why do I teach you that? Because that has to do with your benefit and with your welfare and with your happiness. It is just like he says, he's sitting in a place called the Gosinga wood, or Sapa wood maybe at this particular point. And he, when he's there, he takes up a handful of leaves. It's a famous simile of the Singsapa simile. Takes up a handful of leaves and he says, these leaves in my hand compared to all the leaves on the forest floor, which is more? Right? It's kind of a no-brainer, but obviously he's going to he's obviously going to just make a point. So the monks very dutifully say, "Oh, the leaves in your hand are few; the one on the forest floor are many." Okay, and then he says, "Well, just like the leaves in my hand are few and the ones on the forest floor are many, in the same way, what I have taught you is little, and what I have understood by comprehending it is many in exactly the same way." But I only teach you what is in my hand, because that is what leads to benefit, to welfare, to happiness. All the other stuff I've kind of left on the forest floor, if you like. And a lot of those things that are on the forest floor, I would suspect, are things that are more of a philosophical nature. They have to do with what the world is, right? How the world functions. So why is it that the Buddha doesn't teach that? Well, one of the reasons is that he's pragmatic, he focuses on those things that matter. But another reason, I think, is that once you start to philosophize, in my experience, there is no end to philosophizing. Somebody's going to kind of pick hole in his argument and say, but master, this doesn't really make any sense. And then he kind of has to think, oh no, this monk's always asking these stupid questions, right? And so there is no end to philosophizing. You just keep on going. You can pick it apart. You can find holes in any kind of argument. It's never really going to be complete. Part of the problem is because you're dealing with unenlightened people. They don't really understand what's going on. And of course, that is precisely what happened. As soon as the Buddha passed away, people started creating the Abhidhamma, right? This is exactly what happened. This is the nature of the human mind. We are restless. We like to philosophize. We like ideas about things, and especially if you are kind of reasonably intelligent and you think that you can put things together. It is very satisfying to build up frameworks and to build up these things and write large theses about kind of the nature of the universe, and to think that for that reason you are very, very clever. But then actually you missed out and you hang around in samsara for a long time instead, right? And you suffer as a consequence of that. So cleverness and wisdom are not the same thing. Cleverness can be used wisely, but very often it can lead you astray if you haven't got the inclination to practice these teachings. So that is what full enlightenment is not. It is not about philosophy. And I think this is one of the important things to remember about the Buddhist teachings. It is not a philosophy. If Buddhism is anything, it is a psychology. Yeah, it is about how we use our minds in a good way and how we then come to understand what we are. Psychology is a much better way of thinking about the Buddhist teachings. So, then we have the next one here, perfect in true knowledge and conduct, vidya charana sampanno. And the vidya again that we have already talked about before, here you see it again. In the suttas you normally have 3 types of vidya, 3 types of insight, of true knowledge. And again, just to repeat what I've said before, it's about understanding the idea of rebirth. It's about understanding how karma operates, and it is about understanding the arahantship, the full awakening experience, the ending of all rebirth. That's the kind of third vijja. These are the three, and they parallel the three vijjas that you find in the Brahmanical literature, the Hinduism, if you like, of the day. And it parallels that. Again, the Buddha takes this concept, right? The Brahmins talked about the three vijjas. These are the three vijjas. And for them, that had, what are the three vijjas in Brahmanical literature? Not entirely sure now, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. But for them, it was more about a knowledge, a certain way of doing things, a certain way that things that were handed down through tradition. That was the kind of the vijjas of the Brahmins. And the Buddha takes that concept and he rewrites it, and it says this is actually what it is. These are the real vijjas in the world. And of course, one of those is seeing rebirth, understanding the idea of rebirth, a very important part of the Buddhist teachings. So important that it actually is one of the three true insights on the Buddhist path. So that I'm not going to maybe talk more about that later on, but I will leave it out for now. And then we have the idea not only do you have insight, but you also have conduct. Your insight, if you have real insight, it affects your external behavior. You become a different person. Why? Because your psychology, your internal life is revolutionized. And when you have a revolution in your internal life, it also affects how we live externally. It kind of makes sense. If you always have loving kindness, you're not going to be nasty to people, right? It's kind of obvious. And if you have no real sensual desires, it means you're not going to seek for all the sensual objects and things in the world. You're going to leave that aside, and you're going to be happy just to live a very simple life. If you have no delusion, it means that you are kind of peaceful and you have clarity about yourself, and you're able to answer questions about the nature of mind and these kind of things. And so it has an effect on you. You become different when you have real insight. Sometimes in Buddhist circles you hear about crazy wisdom, and I have to say that crazy wisdom is an oxymoron. You're either crazy or you are wise. You're not both at the same time. So you have a choice, and I would recommend wise over crazy here. So go for the wise part, leave the crazy out. Crazy wisdom often is this idea that, if you are fully awakened, you can start to do whatever you want because you are beyond the worldly things. But that is kind of missing the point as far as I can see, because it affects your conduct when you have real insight. You become a different person. And of course, that is very valuable. It is incredibly valuable because it means that we have a way of measuring people. We have a way of making a judgment. And the Buddha says, you should watch me, look at me. Do I have the qualities or not? And then you gain confidence and faith as a consequence of that. So this is a very valuable thing. So we should really make use of our judgment. We should trust our judgment. We should trust our ability to see these things. Why? Because the Buddha says we should trust ourselves. Who else are you going to trust? There's no one else to really trust. If you trust somebody else, well, it means that you're placing your trust in them. So still your trust in a way. So in the end, it always falls back on you. And we have to, so this is the right way of doing these things, to be honest and to be clear and trust our judgment. Not 100%, it's good to have, of course, humility about these things and realize how fallible we often are and how easy it is to make mistakes. But at least some preliminary judgment, some degree of uncertainty and doubt is very often called for in these things, and that is okay. That is perfectly okay to have that. In fact, we should have that. Not to have that is dangerous, because then you go down the path of gurus and all of this kind of stuff, and that is, of course, always can be very detrimental to anyone's not only spiritual well-being but all kind of well-being. So, knowledge and conduct always going together. And maybe I should mention that now while I'm here, the importance of these true knowledges, because they are actually very, and how they are described in the suttas, because it is actually quite inspiring when you see how the Buddha talks about these things. So he talks about the idea of seeing rebirth, right? And there are different ways of seeing rebirth. One is to see it directly, to recall your past lives. Another one is to understand how the mind works. And by understanding the workings of the mind, how it is conditioned, how it is kept going, if you like, the forces that keep the mind going, you can actually understand rebirth by inference, by understanding how the mind operates. So these are two different ways of understanding rebirth. But the Buddha says when you see rebirth, he says it is like the light going on, right? You come out of darkness, and for the first time you see the reality of things. Somebody's turning on the light, and you think, wow, this is the reality. This is what it is like. I've been fumbling around in darkness all along, not really knowing what is going on. And now, for the first time, I can actually see the reality of things. So it is a very powerful moment, right? When your eyes are opened for the first time, because it changes so much in life once you understand rebirth. It changes where you invest your time, how you invest your time. If life ends, if it all ends at when you become 80 or 90 years old and you die and that's it, then that is one way of looking at the world, and it's quite a common one these days. But if you open up this possibility of rebirth and you see that this samsara, this life doesn't necessarily stop at death, it continues potentially endlessly, it actually gives you a very different incentive, a very different outlook that changes the way you invest your time and you invest your resources in this life. One of the things that I have noticed is that occasionally you have Buddhist monastics who don't have any confidence in rebirth. In my experience, they end up disrobing very often because there is not enough incentive there to keep on practicing the monastic life, especially if you don't get really good results in your meditation, right? If you meditate, if you're kind of not really getting there or it's not really working out, okay, I'm going to give up. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to die in a few years' time anyway, and then everything will be fine, right? That kind of idea. But once you open up the idea of rebirth, it changes how you invest things. Your investment strategy changes, and I will talk more about that later on because it is very, I think, a very interesting part of the Buddhist path. Another simile that the Buddha uses to explain the idea of seeing rebirth is that he says it's like a little chicken inside the eggshell, right? Before it hatches, before it comes out. And you can imagine what the world inside the eggshell is like. Very confined. You have no idea what's going on, basically. When you're in the eggshell, you can see this kind of white thing around you. I guess maybe it isn't white from the maybe it's more like dark from the inside. Not sure. But there's a very limited horizon, right? Everything is very small. The world is very confined. And then one day, you take your little claws and your little beak and you start kind of getting your way out of this eggshell, and suddenly the eggshell cracks open and you think, whoa, right, this is what the world is like. It is just so much vaster, so much bigger, so much more varied, so much more suffering and happiness on all sides than you had ever dreamt of while you were inside that eggshell. And this is exactly what the idea of seeing rebirth is like. You like cracking open the eggshell, seeing reality for the first time. This is what life is like. Wow, if I had known, I would have lived very differently because I would have invested my time differently because now I see where real happiness and where real suffering actually lies. Things open up in a very different way. So thinking about the idea of rebirth, having some confidence in that, even though you may not have seen it for yourself, actually changes our attitude to our existence, and it changes the way we tend to live our life. So it is, for that reason, a very important part of the Buddhist outlook, to the point where it is one of the three true knowledges, one of the real insights on the Buddhist path. So that is the idea of rebirth. And then the other true knowledge is, of course, the idea of seeing beings passing away and re-arising, getting reborn according to the kamma. And this is explained in exactly the same way, the breaking out of the eggshell, the light being turned on, darkness being dispelled, and all of these kind of things. So similar kind of thing. When you see that, you understand the mechanism. There is this impersonal mechanism that drives you from existence to existence. Nothing is ever permanent. There is no such thing as a happy existence that will last forever after. That is impossible from the Buddhist point of view, because everything is caused by conditions, and those conditions only have a certain momentum to them, a certain force. When those conditions come to an end, that state itself comes to an end. So you understand this impersonal mechanism, and then you know that you're a bit like a yo-yo going through samsara, up and down through existences, right? Not really being in charge of where you're going next. And that is the idea of kamma that underlies this idea of rebirth. And the last one of the three vijjas, which is also described in the same way as the breaking out of the eggshell, and that is the attainment of awakening itself. Becoming an arahant, becoming a Buddha, seeing, having the deepest insight into the nature of existence, seeing the Four Noble Truths, the three characteristics, dependent origination, and taking that all the way to the end of the path. Yeah, so fascinating that things like rebirth and seeing kamma is here at the same level with the full awakening experience in terms of the similes that are being used for it. So in other words, these things are very powerful insights. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Buddha himself, he had the insight into past lives before he reached his awakening experience. Because that gave him the motivation, the impetus, that little extra push to be able to understand that, to be able to move him towards full awakening. He realized the limitations, in fact, not just the limitations, the downright problems of samsaric existence. Okay, true knowledge and conduct. So, sublime is the next one here. Sublime is the sugata, sugata being one of the important epithets of the Buddha as well. All of these are the epithets of the Buddha. Sugata, gata means gone. Su is well, so it literally means something like the well gone. And sometimes it is actually translated as the well gone. And it doesn't mean all that much in English. Well gone, what does that mean? That's a bit kind of weird. And but what it actually really refers to is this idea of having gone to a good destination. Sugati and dugati, these are the destinations in Buddhism in terms of rebirth. Here, of course, it's got nothing to do with rebirth. It just means that someone has arrived at the good destination. You could perhaps translate it as the happy one, possibly, because it means that you have attained the kind of the final happiness, the final thing, but a happy one in a very kind of specific sense, of course. That is the sugata. Then we have the knower of the worlds, which is the loka vidu. And this is another, I think, interesting epithet of the Buddha. And of course, it can refer to different things. It could refer to the idea that you understand the rebirth, the kamma that goes there, that you have maybe a philosophical understanding of the world and all of these kind of things. But in the end, the thing that really matters in Buddhism is what? It's happiness and suffering. Why? Because that is what really matters in our lives. What gives anything meaning, what gives anything value in our life is feeling, right? Feeling is what gives value to things. Without feeling, things are valueless. If you make a choice, it is always based on feeling. When I say feeling, I don't mean emotion. I mean feeling. I mean good, bad, or neutral feeling. Is it a positive association or a negative association? Yeah, and that is what gives things value. And that's why, when people talk about robots and computers and driverless cars and this kind of stuff, this is why these things can never really have any aims or purposes, because they have no value. They don't feel the world. And because they don't feel the world, because they're just some kind of algorithm or some kind of program making very fast calculations, that is all it is. It is aimless. It has no aim apart from that program that is written into it and that drives it forward. What makes a being special is that we feel. We feel the world, and that is what gives things value. Yeah, so everything is value according to what it feels for us. Something has good feeling, it's positive value. Something has bad feeling, it has negative value. So the knower of the world is someone who knows the world in terms of feelings. What are the negative potential in this world? What is the positive potential? Is it possible to be reborn in such a place that positive potential lasts forever? If that was the case, maybe that's what we should do instead of going for nibbana, right? Which means something like extinguishment. So maybe happiness forever, maybe that's better than being extinguished. I don't know, maybe not. But that's we'll leave that aside for now. But the point is, the Buddha understands what is really of value for beings. So he has investigated the world fully in terms of the potential for happiness and suffering, seeing all possible rebirths in bad destinations, in good destinations, how long they can last, what is the mechanism behind them. Once you understand the mechanism behind them, you understand whether they are permanent and impermanent and all of these kind of things. And once you have understood that, once you have known the world in terms of feeling, because that is what we value, then you can make a decision whether you want to go towards full awakening, whether you want to leave it all behind, or whether you should be reborn in a particular state, or whatever you should do. Only that gives you that foundation. So knower of the world is really, from my point, at least one way of looking at knowing knower of the world is the full understanding of the scope of experience that is possible for a being in this life, in other lives, and all these kind of things. Sometimes people have problems with this idea that it might be possible to be reborn in different states. Maybe you can be reborn as an animal, maybe you can be reborn as a higher being, maybe you can be reborn as a lower being, maybe you can be reborn as a ghost, right? Come back and scare your relatives or whatever. That'd be very naughty, so don't I think that will probably if you have that idea, you might actually get reborn as a ghost and you really regret it afterwards, because ghosts are not very happy, right? So please don't be reborn as a ghost. But how can we look at this idea of being reborn in different realms in a way that kind of makes sense, that doesn't seem so alien and seems so strange to us? And the way that I like to look at the idea of being reborn in different realms is not to think of them as some kind of alien kind of existence or realm, but rather consider just human experience. Now, in human experience, you have a fairly broad range of experiences, from the person who is born in the most difficult circumstances in the war zone with no education, perhaps not very intelligent, with almost no wealth or anything like that. Some people are born in very, very difficult circumstances. And the other end of the scale, you have people who are born who are intelligent, who are who are wealthy, who have a good education, have a kind family who support them, right? And who have lived a reasonably happy life. So a human life already gives us a fairly wide span of differences, from a lot of suffering to a lot of happiness. Now, when we think about rebirth in different realms, it is just an expansion of the possibilities in the human realm. We take further that person who was born in very dire circumstances, even you stretch that down even further down in a negative direction. And the person who was born in very great circumstances, you just stretch it out further in a positive direction. Yeah, That is really all it is. It is nothing more than that. If you get reborn in any one of these other realms, it is not alien at all. It is just suddenly you are there. Okay, now you're here, and things are a bit more happy than they were before, right? Things are a bit more joyful. You get reborn in the heavenly realm. You have ambrosia rather than ordinary human food, right? And this kind of stuff. You kind of hear, hopefully we don't hear too much harp music, because that would be annoying after a while, but anyway, you get more of the pleasures of the world and less of the suffering, and that's really all it is. You find yourself just in different circumstances. That's really all it is. It's not really all that weird at all once you think about it in the right way. So that just to give you some idea how to think about these things, that they kind of make a little bit more sense to you. Then we have the idea that the Buddha is the incomparable leaders of tameable people, right? So the first thing here is that you have to be tameable, which is interesting. So tameable means that at the very least you have to have some interest in the Buddha's teachings. You have to have some interest in the spiritual life, and if you do have some interest in that, then of course you are heading in the right direction. You are tameable to some extent. And he is the incomparable leader of persons to be tamed. What does that mean? Of course, it has to do with the fact that he has the insight into the reality of human existence, or any kind of existence, and that already gives him the raw material to work with. The second factor that makes the Buddha such a powerful teacher is, of course, the compassion. The understanding. He knows that he has the answer to what everyone is looking for. And because he knows that, he's driven by compassion to teach others so that they too can realize that highest happiness in the world. Yeah, that is what drives the Buddha, that wisdom, the insight on the one hand, and the consequence of that insight is the compassion that he has for beings, because he knows that he actually has the ability to help people. And that is very, very nice and very, very powerful. One of the things about the Buddha, remember, he has finished all that he needs to do in this life. He doesn't have any more suffering. The ideal thing for a Buddha to do is just to sit down and meditate and enter the jhanas and even higher states of samadhi beyond the jhanas. That is what would be natural for the Buddha to do, because he's just now kind of basically hanging around, right, and not kind of waiting for life to come to an end, if you wish, and just enjoying that state of liberation that he already has. But instead of doing that, instead of kind of just enjoying himself while he is still here, he actually decides, I'm going to go out and teach people instead. And for the Buddha, that is a degree of burden, because it means that there is less time to just meditate, less time to go into the forest and just be by yourself and enjoy the bliss and happiness of awakening. So for the Buddha, it is actually almost like a negative thing, the idea of teaching people. He does it despite the fact that for him it will be a degree of suffering. And this is what makes it so interesting, because for most teachers in the world, there is some degree perhaps of ulterior motive or vested interest in being a teacher. If you are a school teacher, you are making a salary, right? Perhaps you want to be respected by your students. If you are a spiritual teacher who is not 100% pure, perhaps you want to have disciples, or perhaps you want to make more money to build up, to have an extra Rolls Royce or whatever, that kind of stuff. You hear about these spiritual teachers, right? Sometimes you find these kind of people. So there's all kind of reasons for being a teacher that is not really pure and not really good. And this is what you can expect to some degree if you have a sense of self, because the sense of self wants to be gratified one way or another. But the Buddha has none of that. There's no vested interest. There's no ulterior motive. Nothing like that. All it is compassion. That's the only thing that drives him. And as I like to say, he has a negative vested interest, because for the Buddha it would be preferable to stay in the forest and meditate rather than teach people at all. So because of that means that the teachings of the Buddha, they are very pure. There's none of the I in there, the me, the benefit for the Buddha himself. All of that is out the window. Everything in this Buddhist teachings is for our benefit. So when you read these words of the Buddha, remember that he's teaching this purely for our benefit, nothing else. It means that you can sort of put your faith and your trust in these words in a much more profound sense, because you know that these are very pure and powerful teachings. Anyone else, and I literally mean anyone else, you may have some doubt as to whether the teachings are 100% pure. Yeah. But with the Buddha, you can have this feeling that these teachings really are 100% pure. And it means that when you read them, when you think about them, you take them much more seriously. It means that you look at every word and you think, and even if there is something that you may not like, that may go against the grain or whatever, you still consider it seriously, because you know that the Buddha, he wouldn't have said this unless it was important for our benefit. Yeah, and this is what makes the Buddha so incomparable, this purity with which he's presenting his teachings. Another thing which I have always found very, maybe I'll move on to the next one, because it maybe fits better under there. So this is what makes the Buddha the incomparable leader, the profound insight and the compassion. Those two things coming together is what makes him special. So let us have a look at teacher of gods and humans. And this is another interesting one, and you may wonder why gods is included there. What has that got to do with it? After all, we are humans, we are not gods. And the reason why it is included there is, of course, that throughout history, people believe in gods, sometimes many gods, sometimes a single god, but gods is a very important part of human culture. Human culture doesn't really exist without the idea of God, it seems, except even in Buddhism we have the idea of gods. But what the Buddha is saying is that just because you are a god, it doesn't mean you have all that much wisdom. You can be a silly god or a deluded god, and you may be very glorious and very happy, but doesn't mean you have much wisdom. And very often when one of the interesting things about these gods is that precisely they're often very powerful. They are very glorious. The way they are talked about in the suttas, sometimes you have the gods coming down to visit the Buddha, and there's a blinding light, right, and very powerful, and everything is kind of illuminated. The whole wood is illuminated, and everything becomes very beautiful because the god comes down. And there is one quite nice little story. This is from the Sakapanya Sutta. This is the questions of Sakka. Sakka is like the lord of the Tavatimsa heaven, the heaven of 33. And he comes down to the Buddha, and this blinding light, right, and everything is kind of illuminated. And when the Buddha just sits there and says, yes, okay, welcome Sakka, please ask your questions, whatever it is. And then the Buddha says to him, well, what happened when do you admit that previously you also visited other spiritual teachers prior to visiting me? And the Sakka says, yes. Well, what happened when you visited these other spiritual teachers? And Sakka says, well, I came to them to get some wisdom, to ask these saints about, the reality, about understanding human life and all these things. I wanted to become their disciples. But when they saw me and they saw the blinding light, they bowed down in front of me and became my disciples instead. That was the problem with this kind of spiritual teachers. They didn't really have any real wisdom. And this is the thing, when you see something really magnificent like that, it is very easy to become completely overwhelmed and think that you have found something very powerful. But in fact, all you are seeing is you're seeing something very powerful, but you don't really know whether there is any real wisdom there. And this is kind of the point. We tend to allow ourselves to be sidetracked by side issues rather than focusing on the core of what really matters, which of course is the wisdom. And this is why the Buddha makes it very clear that even if there are gods in the world, even if there are these very powerful beings, and maybe we will be a god ourselves one day, despite that, the real wisdom is found somewhere else, and that is why the Buddha is the teacher of gods and humans. So it is an important part. And you can imagine that in Indian society always had lots and lots of gods. Everybody has their own personal god, right? You have a little shrine at home and you kind of worship that personal god. And the Buddha comes along and says, I'm the teacher of your God, right? It would have had a very powerful impact on people, and rightly so. So how is it that the Buddha is our teacher? In what sense is he our teacher? And this is one of the things that I have often reflected on, because I certainly take the Buddha to be my final and highest teacher. The Buddha is, in a sense, the final authority in the Buddhist teachings. And how is it? How can you take the Buddha to be your personal teacher? And I think this is a very important way of thinking, because it can draw you closer to be a real disciple of the Buddha, rather than having this sense of cultural and time distance to the Buddha. He lived at a very different time in a very different culture. It's very easy to feel the distance rather than feel the closeness. And one way of thinking about this is to remember that when the Buddha taught these teachings, he realized that he was setting in motion the wheel of the Dhamma. The wheel of the Dhamma is the teachings rolling on in the world from one generation to another one, rolling on from one culture to another culture. So he realized that. He specifically says that I'm setting in motion the wheel of the Dhamma. He knew that the Dhamma would last for a long time into the future, and it would move from one culture to the next one. So he knew that there would be people, right, sitting in a place like Jana Grove, near Perth in Western Australia in the year 2017. He kind of knew that. And because he knew that, he expressed these teachings in such a way that we too could understand these things. And this is kind of the point with these Buddhist teachings. They are so universal. They are so inclusive, regardless of cultural background, regardless of time, regardless of where we are. And that is what is so powerful about them. You read them now, and there are a few things in there that are a bit kind of quaint and kind of weird, right? But the vast majority of the real psychological teachings of the Buddha are just as directly, speak to us just as directly today as they did 2,500 years ago. So when the Buddha gave these teachings, he was thinking about us, right? He was thinking about us here today, every one of us. These teachings were actually spoken with everyone in mind. Everyone, whatever cultural background you have, whatever time you lived in, they are spoken directly to us. So remember that when you read these teachings, the Buddha actually had you in mind. He was thinking about you specifically. Maybe specifically is a bit too strong a word, but he was thinking about any human being, if you like, is part of that. So read that and know that the Buddha is talking directly to you when you read this suttas. And when you think about it in that way again, it becomes much more powerful because you get the feeling that you actually are in the presence of the Buddha in a very real sense when you read these things. And when you do that, you listen in a different way. If you are in the presence of the greatest spiritual master that humanity has ever had, the greatest human being that has existed in this as long as history, through known history or whatever you want to call it, if you have that feeling that you are in the presence of this supreme being and he is speaking directly to you in this way, wow, it makes it so much more powerful. So think like that. Remember that this is actually the case. The Buddha wasn't just teaching to the disciples then. He was setting in motion the wheel of the Dhamma for the future. He was talking to everyone. He's talking directly to us. And this makes it far more urgent, far more powerful to have a teacher like that who's teaching you in this particular way. So again, the idea with this is just to give rise to a certain way of thinking, a certain perception that makes these teachings much more powerful when we read them. And we need that to be able to make these things as personal and as important and powerful as we possibly can, because then they start to have much more impact in our life. And that is what, of course, this is all about. Anyway, I will stop there because I've already been talking for an hour roughly. So keep on practicing well, enjoying yourself, and we'll see you again at 3 p.m. this afternoon.